Alright, grade 9, as always, I hope that you are doing okay. I hope that you have consumed all the information and studied enough for what we have already covered in topic 5, number 3. As a quick reminder, in topic 5, number 3, we have been speaking about the ancient Greeks regarding thinkers, artists, and also the writers. While speaking about them, we have considered some of the most important philosophers in the course of the history regarding the era or that period. Especially, we have spoken about Socrates, about Aristotle, and also about Plato. We have also mentioned the logic and how those thinkers and philosophers were lovers of wisdoms and they conveyed their ideas and their thoughts in order to help their society, and mentioned that they always sought for perfection, sought the past of seek. They wanted perfection. Perfection in the form of the government, perfection in the art, perfection in poetry, perfection in everything. About the rhetoric, we have spoken about how those people, or some sort of the people, they are called the sophisticates. They used their ability to manipulate the speaking and to alternate in their favor, how to convince someone but what they wanted. One of these people was the great philosopher Socrates. Yet Socrates used his method, which was named after him, after his name, the Socratic method, in order to show the truth for the people. He conveyed truth for them. And unfortunately, some of the hypocrites whom did not like his method and telling the people the truth, they have convicted him for treason because he was corrupting the youth, they claim. So they sentenced him to death and he took and drank a poisonous drink. His student Plato fled from Athens after his teacher Socrates was killed, and he came years later called the Academy. In that school, he followed the principle of the teacher Socrates and he presented to people truth, but in another form, in the form of the ideal society. In the form of the ideal society. Okay, and of course, to do that, he has divided the society into three main categories. Okay, workers, soldiers, and philosophers. Later, after Plato, his most magnificent student Aristotle came to provide for us a variety of written books and written literature about art, about philosophy, and about many other important topics, including poetry also and other forms of writing. Aristotle has followed the path of his two previous teachers, Plato and also Socrates, and by doing so, he enabled the people to understand more clearly about the importance of that society. Consequently, he left for us a variety of books that up till this day we are still studying them. Later, we have spoken about some form of architecture of the ancient Athenian people, including one of the most important construction at that time, which was the Parthenon. The Parthenon, and we said that the Parthenon was a temple made for the honoring of the goddess Athena, as the Athenian people took the name of their city from here. So they made that rectangular construction only for here. And in that form of architecture, we see how perfect was portrayed at that period. Simple yet elegant. Simple yet elegant. And also, none of the arts or the architecture of what the ancient Greek people had left us survived that whole period, except for some patterns that portrays the day-to-day activities in the society, like women, for example, bringing water from streams and warriors getting ready for battle or fighting their own wars. Another thing we have spoken about is tragedy. Tragedy. And we said that tragedy means something or some tale that always ends in suffering or in sadness or sorrow or death or betrayal, something that triggers our human emotions in order to put ourselves in the shoe of the hero or the heroine of the tale so that we avoid putting ourselves in that situation in the future. And of course, we have some of the most important tragedies all over history written by those Greek playwriters. Did we take the comedy also? Hello?
The comedy?
Yes, did we study
Yes.
comedy yesterday? Ah, 9-3 did not have it. All right,
We
so
finished the teacher, the lesson.
I believe there is still one point then. Herodotus and the studying history via Herodotus. Okay, so regarding the comedy, comedy also was another form of literature by the ancient Greek people, yet it was another form totally distinguished and different from that of tragedy. Because in comedy, they try to portray day to day activities, like what's happening nowadays in their life. They portray that in the comedy, and they try to address some of the most important issues that they are facing at that time via comedy. So it was unlike tragedy. Tragedy focused on past, yet comedy focused on present. Last point in this.
Teacher, your screen is not changing from
Oh,
5 minutes.
so to speak about the last point in this topic, we will mention now speaking about studying history. So, who volunteers to read?
I read
Okay, Abdurrahman.
studying history. The Greeks also applied observation, reason, and logic to the study of history. Herod- Herodotus is often called the father of history in the Western world because he went beyond listing names of rulers or the retelling of ancient legends. Before writing the Persian Wars, Herodotus visited many lands collecting information from people who remembered the actual events he chronicled. In fact, Herodotus used the Greek term history, which means inquiry, to define his work. Our history comes from this word, but its definition has evolved today to simply mean the recording and study of past events.
So, simply to speak about studying history of that era or that period of the Athenian people and also the Greek people as well, we tend to study some of the most important writings left for us by the great historian Herodotus. Herodotus himself, he was considered the father of history. The father of history. Why is that? We tend, while studying history, to just list the information, what happened, who was the king in that era, what did the people use to do. Yet, on the other hand, we come counter that Herodotus did not do that. On the other hand, Herodotus, he traveled himself. He started asking people and inquiring about the needed information. Consequently, he had the most accurate events that had happened in that time. So he just tried to seek truth in his writings. Not any tale, not anything that is being told he can include in his writing. Yet he inquired, asked, investigated, and made a lot of effort so that he presents for us that period in its elegant flourishment and development, and even its downfall. All shall be true. Herodot also. Continue, Abdurrahman.
Herodotus cast a critical eye on his sources, noting bias and conflicting accounts. However, despite this special care for detail and accuracy, his writings reflected his own view that the war was a clear moral victory of Greek love of freedom over Persian tyranny. He even invented conversations and speeches for historical figures.
All right. So, Herodot also presented for us a critical eye. What is the meaning of a critical eye? So, a critical eye here, guys, means like I'm teaching you right now about the Athenian people. I'm teaching you about the Greek civilization, right? So, you need to develop a critical eye to see those events. Shall they be repeated in our time nowadays or not? Shall they to be condemned for being good or condemned for being bad? So he cast a critical eye on his sources. So I'm asking Abdurrahman right now, what happened, Abdurrahman, in the fight you witnessed yesterday, for example? So he tells me, oh, the first man hit the second man, and the second man brought a knife and he killed the man just directly. So I need to connect his tale, what is he telling me, to see can they be true or not. So he tried to cast his critical eye on what he hears before writing his historical stories. Okay, so he did not just listen to everyone and just wrote what they say. No, he first adapted the critical eye and started by seeking truth. For him, however, despite this special care of details and accuracy, his writing reflected his own view that the war was just a clear moral victory of the Greek love of freedom over the Persian tyranny. So, meaning that although he sought for seeking truth very, very much in his writing, yet he also included his own opinion while writing about history. Because that's my critical eye. I see that this thing happened because this boy loved this girl. So they got married. Another example, in the Trojan War, I see that all the war happened because of some political reasons. It was totally apart from Paris and Helen. They were totally apart from that love story. That's my critical eye, right? In the Persian War again, the Greek, they loved freedom, so they won in the war. They became victory because they loved freedom over the Persian who loved just conquering. So that's my critical eye. So he first started by adapting the critical eye, asking people, traveling to cities, seeking truth in his historical events which he has written and left for us. He even invented conversation and speeches for historical figures, which is an awesome thing actually. So see the imagination right now. So we're speaking about the Trojan War, for example. Okay, we have studied that there are main two reasons for that Trojan War: a romantic one and a political one, right? Remember? Hola.
Yes.
In the Trojan War, we have studied that there are two reasons for that war: romantic and political, right?
Yes.
All right. So, right now, in the romantic reason, for example, we come counter two characters, which are Paris, Prince of Troy, and Helen, the Greek king's wife. So, what's going on between both of them in a dark room, alone, the conversation? Who can know about it? Of course, no one, because they are alone. But Herodot here started to invent conversations between the characteristic figures so that he presents for us the event in a very simple and in a very rational way. So he will present you that, for example, Helena and Paris were alone speaking about how to flee from the injustice of the Greek king so that Helen will go along with Paris to Troy. That was happening between both of them. No one has ever heard it or knew about it. But he just invented that whole conversation to just present other events in a rational way. Okay? Follow me?
Okay.
All right, so simply, he's not called the father of history for nothing, but he had made some great efforts in order to gain that title. Another historian was Socrates, who was a few years younger than Herodotus himself. He wrote about the Peloponnesian War. Remind me again, between whom and whom was the Peloponnesian War?
Athens and
Yes.
Spartans, I think.
Yes, and both along with their allies. So the Peloponnesian War happened between two leagues, okay, not two city-states. Remind that the Peloponnesian War happened between two leagues. The Delian League, headed by Athens and its allies, and the Peloponnesian League, headed by Sparta and its allies. Okay? It was not between two city-states, it was between two leagues, meaning that many city-states. A much less happy subject for the Greeks. He had lived through the war and vividly described the war's savagery and corrupting influence on all those involved. Although he was an Athenian or he was an Athenian person, he tried to be fair to both sides. So he knew that Athens back then was committing something bad and wrong, which led to the Peloponnesian War. So he did not just take sides, he was neutral. Both writers set standards for future historians. Herodotus stressed the importance of research, while Thucydides showed the need to avoid pays, meaning that not to take sides. Very important. Any questions so far?
Teacher, I sent you my presentation yesterday.
I'll check that right now.
Okay.
So far, guys, until now, any problem, any question, anything that you do not understand? If there anything or any question you need to ask me, just write in the chat.
No questions.
Okay, let's check your presentation then.
About the next lesson it was, right?
Yep.
Alexander the Great and the Lexics.
Yes. Alexander the Great, Abdurrahman al-Ibrahim, Abdurrahman al-Ibrahim. Presentation and social. That's the
No,
project, right?
What?
That's the project, right?
No, that's the presentation you gave us yesterday.
The new era of Alexander the Great. Okay, can you start, Abraham?
Yes. The new era of Alexander the Great. Philip II takes control of Greece. Alexander conquers Persia and the march into India. and the early death of Alexander. Philip II takes control of Greece. When Philip II gained the throne at 359 BC, he dreamed of conquering the prosperous city-states to the south. When Athens and Thebes joined forces against him, Philip II defeated them at the Battle of Chaeronea. He then brought all of Greece under his control. He was assassinated at his daughter's wedding. Alexander conquers Persia. Alexander began organizing the forces needed to conquer Persia. Persia was no longer the great power it had once been. The Emperor Darius III was weak, and the provinces were often in rebellion against him. Alexander won his first victory against the Persians at the Granicus River.
Great.
The march into India. With much of the Persian Empire under his control, the restless Alexander headed farther east. Although Alexander never lost a battle, his soldiers were tired of the long campaign and refused to go farther east. Reluctantly, Alexander agreed to turn back. After a long and difficult march, they reached Babylon, where Alexander began planning a new campaign. The early death of Alexander. Before he could set out again, the 32-year-old fell victim to a sudden fever. No one leader proved strong enough to succeed Alexander. Instead, after years of disorder, three generals divided up the empire.
That's a fact. Nice. Excellent presentation, Abdurrahman. Very good. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Did anyone else, guys, made the presentation? All right. So
Teacher, I have a question. I do a project, or this will be my project?
you did not do the project yet?
No.
Well, Abdurrahman, I can consider that as your project if you're not gonna do it.
So should I do one or no?
If you have time, do it. If you don't have time, I'll consider that presentation as your project since no one else did the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. All right. So, guys, to speak about Alexander the Great, we just need to spend like 100 years to speak about this magnificent character. But of course, I'm not gonna speak about him today. I'll just postpone that to yesterday. We will just read something about him and see something very, very small about him.
Quality writing makes your schoolwork better and helps you stand out in the process. It's said that he was born from Zeus himself, a demigod in the flesh. He tamed an unbreakable wild stallion that full-grown men feared to approach at the age of 12. And that horse would carry him to military victory after military victory until his untimely death at the age of 32. He was tutored by one of the ancient world's greatest thinkers. His name says it all, Alexander.
We don't see the video, we see the book only.
What, Abdurrahman?
We see the book, we don't see the video.
Oh, okay. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
It's said that he was born from Zeus himself, a demigod in the flesh. He tamed an unbreakable wild stallion that full-grown men feared to approach at the age of 12. and that horse would carry him to military victory after military victory until his untimely death at the age of 32. He was tutored by one of the ancient world's greatest thinkers. His name says it all, Alexander the Great. But how much about Alexander is really true, and what's fiction? And ultimately, with a whopping 0 Instagram followers, can we truly say that he was all that great? Haters and historians alike will tell you that Alexander the Great was born in 356 BC to the Macedonian king Philip II and his wife Olympias. A true Greek, however, knows that Alexander was actually the love child of Zeus himself, who had a nasty habit of popping down on Earth and taking various animal shapes to con women into sleeping with him. In many ways, Zeus was the original frat boy. Alexander's father was already an impressive figure, a brilliant military leader and politician both. Through force of arms and political maneuvering, he turned Macedonia into a military and cultural powerhouse, which was a pretty impressive feat because in the ancient world, Macedonia was basically the backwoods of Greece. Philip's ambitions, though, weren't limited to his strengthening of Macedonia, and he had a dream that would be handed down to his son, Alexander, to conquer the mighty empire of Persia. To date, Persia had been a world superpower, premier in many fields of science and philosophy, and it was backed by a formidable military which tried again and again to destroy the stubborn and defiant Greeks. To dream of conquering this mighty nation was, to put it lightly, a very optimistic dream. At the age of 13, Alexander was personally tutored by Aristotle, a man so famous that even if you know nothing about his teachings, you definitely recognize the name. One of the ancient world's greatest minds, Aristotle fostered a curiosity in the young prince and sharpened an already formidable intellect. Alexander learned philosophy, medicine, politics, and art from Aristotle, and also that he should treat non-Greeks as if they were slaves. Thankfully, when Alexander would begin his military conquests later in life, he would discard this belief, and this would help him establish his mighty if short-lived empire. In 340 BC, Philip went off to attack Byzantium and left the young Alexander in charge of things at home. Alexander used the opportunity to prove that even though he was just a teenager, he was destined to be a great leader, and gathered the army for a successful attack against the Madai, a people who lived in what's now the southeastern Baltics. 2 years later, Philip returned home, determined to unite Greece under one banner, and went to war against a coalition of Greek city-states led by Thebes and Athens. In that battle, Alexander led the cavalry to a triumphant defeat over the legendary Sacred Band of Thebes, a fighting force made up of 150 pairs of lovers. The victory catapulted an already popular Alexander to new heights of popularity with the Macedonian military. Alexander would need that popularity too, as a year later Philip divorced Alexander's mother, and then in a feast to celebrate his new marriage, Philip got into a fight with Alexander over his new wife. Alexander and his mother fled for fear of their lives, though Philip and Alexander were soon reconciled, and he was allowed to return home. When Philip was assassinated shortly after, though, Alexander was not the clear heir to the throne, and he rallied the support of the military to help him kill his potential rivals. Solidifying his grip over Greece, Alexander then attended an assembly of Greek city-states, which had already been called for by his father. The Greeks were finally going to make good on the ancient dream of conquering Persia, and the assembly unanimously voted to make Alexander supreme commander of Greek forces. Before crushing Greece's ancient rival, though, he needed to secure the Greek peninsula. Alexander spent some time bringing wayward city-states into the fold, often by military force, as well as waging campaigns against the Thracians to the north. While in battle, though, rumors of his death circulated back in Greece, and the city-state of Thebes used the opportunity to revolt. As many other Greek city-states favored Thebes over Alexander, support for the fledgling rebellion flowed in, especially from Athens. Upon hearing of the brewing revolt, Alexander forced a hard march on his troops, traveling an astounding 240 miles in just 2 weeks to the gates of Thebes. The Thebans, however, refused to rejoin Alexander, and he was forced to lay siege to the city, ultimately burning it to the ground and selling off any survivors into slavery. With the rest of the city-states terrified at the treatment of Thebes, they quickly fell in line. And in an act of generosity which would earn him some favor with the Greeks, he forgave Athens' betrayal. Leaving behind 3 garrisons, Alexander was now free to take on Persia. By comparison, Greece was tiny versus mighty Persia, but Alexander was confident that his men were better trained and equipped. His superior troops would outweigh Persia's superior numbers. That theory would be put to the test in 333 BC, when Alexander's forces met with a massive Persian army led by the new king Darius III. Alexander's belief that his superior troops could win out over superior numbers was well-founded. The Persians had largely become complacent in the last century, and their military forces suffered from a noticeable lack of discipline, as well as a lack of cavalry. Alexander, by comparison, fielded an army comprised of archers, javelin throwers, infantry, and heavy cavalry. His mastery of what was in that day combined arms warfare saw him utterly crush the Persian forces laid out against him. With defeat inevitable, the Persian king fled the battlefield with the few forces that he could muster into a hasty withdrawal. Darius III was so hasty in his retreat that he even left behind his own wife and family, and his mother was so ashamed of him that she disowned him publicly and adopted Alexander as her own son. This gesture would be paramount to Alexander's cementing of his grip on what was formerly the Persian Empire. Over the next
And of course, we shall discuss all of this tomorrow. So far, so good, I believe. Any questions so far regarding the Athenian philosopher, thinkers? Anything from what we have studied so far in topic 5.3? If the answer is no, you are welcome to leave.